The science of identity shapes our life more than almost any other thing. And so it's surprising that many of us have never studied or explored identity through a scientific lens. And this is admittedly a drop in the bucket, a primer to a whole field of potential statistics, awareness, distinctions that can empower us to work with one of the most influential dynamics on the planet today. So, what are some of the functions of identity? One of the things that an identity allows us to do is to recognize uniqueness, to recognize, in this case, who we are. How do we know who we are? Who I am, who you are? How can we recognize that information and be clear, this is you, this is me? An identity is born out of a habit, a repeat pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing. Now, obviously, there are different distinctions. There's tones of speaking, there are the words, there are the silences, there are the sequences of the words. All of that is implied in speaking. And there's also the physical identity, the pattern of energy that holds this energy, this pattern of cells in this series of organizational structures as opposed to another. How do I know that this body is mine? Well, it had brown hair yesterday, it had brown hair the day before. You could say that this body has a habit of organizing the energy that consists of this body in a particular way. And so we say, I've seen that face before. I saw it when I looked in the mirror over here, I saw it over here, I saw it here, I saw it in this photograph. I seem to show up everywhere this image of a body shows up. And this image of a body seems to show up everywhere I show up. So this body is me. And how do we know these are my thoughts and my feelings? Well, I had them yesterday, and I had them the day before that. So an identity is simply a habit, a pattern of energy. And one of the functions of an identity is to serve as a baseline for understanding and getting to know reality, the patterns of energy that are out there. Now, you've probably noticed, as I have, that we are slightly different people, or drastically different people, depending on the set and the setting, depending on the people and the context in which we're engaged, with which we are engaging. So if I'm with someone who's very carefree, laughs a lot, and we're at a beach in a pretty safe environment, there's a high likelihood that I'm going to, through mirror neurons, through the infectious memes of patterns, I'm going to become a little bit more carefree. I'm going to start laughing more as well. And what this allows me to do is understand another person's influence and the influence of being on the beach. Because if I was in a serious board meeting where smiles were met with cold faces, statistically speaking, I'm going to be more serious and I'm not going to smile, thus revealing to me the influence of that group of people in that set and setting. Now, if by contrast, I'm with someone with a high degree of spontaneity, a lot of laughter, a lot of playfulness, and we're in a plane that they do not know how to fly, and we're heading towards Earth at high speed, I will do the exact opposite. Meaning I will try and interrupt the state, assuming I take my physical cohesive identity with some degree of attachment. I want to live, and I want to live as me, and so I want to interrupt this protocol that's likely to go up in flames any minute now. Assuming I have attachment to this identity, then the carefreeness, the spontaneity, the innocence, the ignorance with which the plane is being flown will result not in me becoming more frivolous, more spontaneous, and more playful, but the exact opposite. The exact opposite, meaning the more frivolous the pilot, the more nervous and upset I become. The more ignorant the pilot, the more I want to learn what's going on. And by contrast, a very knowledgeable, very serious, very competent pilot that's doing their job very well and has done their job very well before, I might open up and be more relaxed and give them a punch on the shoulder and say, come on, you can relax a little bit. You don't have to, you've got autopilot, we're at 30,000 feet, there's good weather, you don't have to be quite so studious, let's relax. And so we can see that depending on the context that we're in, depending on our attachment, depending on the behavior of the other person, we move towards an identity, opening up, agreeing, saying yes, or we move away from the identity to counterbalance, in the sense that if you're in a boat and again you're attached to staying dry and you notice that the boat is about to tip over because everyone is leaning on one side of the boat and nobody seems to grasp basic principles of physics or understand how to pilot the boat, and many of them don't know how to swim, you will do the opposite of the majority, the opposite of your partner, in order to express your respect for what you are attached to: life, safety, money, health, whatever it is. You will flow with the identity or you will resist. Because a group identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing as a group. And it has more influence. It has the possibility of overwhelming through the law of mass. The law of mass, which says that when a bowling ball and a pinball collide, the pinball goes flying, and the bowling ball continues its movement, largely uninterrupted, absorbing the energy of the pinball and continuing on its original trajectory with minimal impact. The law of mass that we're each aware of, the law of mass that sees so many individuals conforming to the crowd, fitting in, understanding that an individual, statistically speaking, is absorbed or bounces off a group, rather than changing an entire group's momentum, all things being equal, unless there is cooperation, unless there is a shift in consciousness. If the individual creates a shift in consciousness in the majority within the group, then the majority within the group will pivot to a new identity, a new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing that's more in line with their desired outcome. Now, we need an identity, we need a base point in order to understand the influence and the impact of groups and other people and things in our environment. For example, if we are a canvas and we are a state of white that is continuously white, then we can understand that this red is slightly different than this red, that this brown is different than this red, that this green is different from that yellow. We can see it clearly because we've got a consistent backdrop, a habitual backdrop of a unified, consistent identity. Now, if at each moment we are becoming different colors of white, then it's much harder to tell what is us and what is the color that is interacting with us. It becomes confusing to know what is me and what is you. And so one of the attachments we and other people have to a stable identity, to a consistent identity, is it allows us to isolate impact and change in our environment that is otherwise impossible to do. We cannot notice small changes in our environment if we are changing to a large extent at the same time. For example, if our hearing sensitivity went up or down somewhat erratically, we couldn't tell that the music was going up or down or whether our hearing sensitivity was going up or down. If our eyes' sensitivity to light changed erratically, then we would have two questions, not where is the light coming from, but is it me or is it the light? Why has my eye suddenly become more sensitive, or why did the light suddenly turn on? What is it? And so a stable identity gives us a base point from which to learn about the world. Now, the pattern is distinct from others. Identity is unique. A thumbprint is a stable pattern of energy expressed in a shape, a series of shapes that are unique. So one of the things that is true about identity is that every authentic identity is completely unique. There never has been or will be an identity exactly like it. And one of the reasons for that is that identity, aside from being a base point, is in flux and is ecological in nature. No identity exists out of context with the people and environments that shaped it. And this is true for a couple of reasons. No identity is the largest object in the space. If you look at you and I, we are smaller than the planet. We have less mass, psychologically and physically, than the planet. We are smaller than our culture. We have less mass than our culture, physically and psychologically. We are smaller than our family. We are smaller than our parents. Now, what this means in the law of mass is that as an identity, we have been shaped more by our environment than we have shaped our environment. The birth of one infant leads to an equation where the infant will predictably, in an English-speaking cult, speak English. In a sociopathic cult, be sociopathic, or have at least elements, sociopathic tendencies. The law of mass dictates that the environment into which a distinct individual identity is born has had, over time, more influence on that identity than the identity has had on the environment. Being born an American has more impact on the individual than the individual has, statistically speaking, on American culture. And so one cannot be a distinct individual without being influenced by the larger masses into which we are nested and upon which we depend for the underlying drive to survive, to feel secure, to experience love and belonging and self-esteem. The four first needs in the hierarchy of human needs developed by Abraham Maslow in the study of healthy individuals around the globe. All human beings, statistically speaking, will first seek to survive, will then seek to be secure in that survival. Now, when a larger energy has more influence on a smaller energy than the smaller energy has on the larger energy, in order to survive, one must attune. Attunement or adjustment or integration or relationship between an individual body and a bus suggests, through the lens of the law of mass, that if the individual does not get out of the way of the bus, or if the driver does not stop the bus for the individual, that if these two collide, the identity of the individual is disintegrated, falls apart. The pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing that is unique to that individual dissipates with death and decomposition. And the pattern of the bus continues. The law of superior mass. The fact that we exist in the context of vast objects, vast patterns of energy upon which we depend for survival, security, love, and belonging, means that the individual is shaped in the environment around it, in the language they speak, in the emphasis of thought, in the tendency to tonally be in this range. If you're born in Japan, your tonal range will be different than in the United States. If you're born in a certain century, your articulation of words, your accent will be different than in another century. And this law of mass means that the individual is innately connected to the larger patterns of energy around them, while being a distinct mirror of that energy. In other words, you cannot extrapolate and isolate a sustainable individual identity out of context with its history, with the larger patterns of energy around it. What is born in response, in relationship. The identity, the pattern of thinking, speaking, feeling, and doing is in relationship with that which is around it, which means that each individual in a space is reflecting a part a face of the space in which it exists. Which means that you and I and everyone on this planet is an expression, a unique expression of the host energy bodies, of the larger energy constructs in which we are in proximity, as a family, as a boss, as a religion, as a paradigm, as a cult, as a planet, as a physical universe. And so when we say we do not like this individual, we are saying we do not like the face of reality that they are mirroring back. As a microcosm, as a fractal representation of an environment that produces that distinct face in an individual. We cannot isolate the individual from the ecological energy patterns out of which they emerge. If I do not like you, I do not like your family, I do not like the culture that gave birth to your family, I do not like the planet that gave birth to your culture, I do not like the physicality that gave birth to the planet, because one doesn't exist without the other. They are interconnected. And it takes a stunning amount of mental judo to isolate in concept patterns of energy that are ecologically connected. The degree of trauma, pain, PTSD, and the fear that emerges out of a history of pain projected on the future determines the degree with which the future, which is neutral, the unknown, which is neutral, and chaos, which is neutral, is regarded as a positive or negative force. The degree to which we are traumatized and unsuccessful at integrating, digesting, and healing that trauma is to the degree that we will experience pain, a rupturing of identity. To the degree that we experience pain that we cannot digest and heal is to the degree that we will be frightened of encountering a future, an unknown, an energy pattern that produces more pain. If we cannot master our relationship with pain in the past, we cannot master our relationship with pain in the future. If there is an energy pattern, be it a bus, be it a knife, be it a gun, be it a partner, if there is an energy pattern that traumatically interrupts our pattern of energy and produces pain, and because of the law of mass, because of the law of consciousness, the law of consciousness is we cannot influence something we do not understand in language. If we understand something at a level of mastery, we know our limits and we know what we can and cannot do to influence it. If something is beyond our limits or outside our understanding, or is experienced as hostile as an overwhelming shape. We are in a crisis in which our identity is threatened with interruption, with dissolution, with disintegration. Our identity, who we say we are, the me that I think I am, is in jeopardy of dissolving because I do not have a peaceful, masterful relationship with energies that I do not understand, that are larger than me, which have interrupted my pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing before. And because that precedent is there, and that precedent is unresolved, I have not developed a response capable of dealing with that precedent. I must then have fear, which is the anticipation of trauma, of disruption in the future. Meaning, if you encounter me, and before you can think, before you can develop a strategy, I have surprised you with a mass of energy that dissociates you from your current identity. And you have no idea what to do about it. You've called the police, you've read this, you've tried practicing judo, but you haven't mastered it. It doesn't seem to work. The police don't get there in time. They never do. The technique you used isn't perfect. And it happens again, and it happens again. There is a violation. There is violence. To what? To your identity, to your unique pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing. That you look around and you say, that's me. And who I call me, I lose it. I lose my identity. It goes into shock. It disintegrates in proximity with this pattern. And I can't stop it. The intelligent and natural response to unresolved traumatic pain in the past is anticipation of unresolved traumatic pain in the future. And it is rational because all cycles repeat until they are interrupted or met with a superior consciousness, with a superior technology, or a superior mass. All patterns repeat unless they are interrupted with a superior consciousness, a superior technology, or a superior mass. You can have a bowling ball can interrupt a pinball, no matter how smart that pinball is, if they collide. You don't need superior intelligence for mass to dominate. 5 bullies can beat the shit out of a very smart 12-year-old boy. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with mass. Or a very smart boy with the right technology and proximity alerts might be able to outsmart and outmaneuver the bullies such that the law of mass doesn't come into play. All traumatic pain will repeat itself until an influx of consciousness, technology, or mass allows for the confident interruption of the traumatic, painful event. So, in a culture that gives rise to large amounts of traumatic pain, one of the outcomes is a high level of fear. Now, what must one fear if one anticipates a collision with a larger mass of energy that is traumatic and or hostile in nature? First of all, one must fear the unknown, because all possible trauma and pain is possible in the unknown. Stuff that you cannot even imagine, that is horrific and traumatic in nature, is in the unknown. Now, stuff that is amazingly beautiful is also in the unknown, but the hierarchy of needs, you don't get to aesthetics and beauty until survival with security is addressed. And so the fact that survival and security is threatened when we identify with an identity, when we say, this is me, this body is me, this pattern of thinking is me, this pattern of feeling is me, this pattern of doing is me, this is me. When we identify ourselves as the identity, then survival is not addressed until we have harmonious relationship with everything bigger than us. And the drive to avoid the past pains and traumas repeating themselves are louder than the drives to avoid mediocrity, the status quo, or the drive to experience exquisite beauty. The hierarchy of human needs determines that the higher the degree of unresolved trauma in the past, the greater the fear of the unknown, the greater the resistance to change, which takes us into the unknown, the greater the resistance of the future, which is the unknown. We resist change, the future, the unknown, when we have unresolved trauma. Now, if we don't want to experience the unknown, we must cling to the familiar. The word familiar emerging out of the word family. A traumatized child clings to the family that abused them. The child that's been beaten and put into foster care runs away and goes back home. The traumatized child, afraid of the unknown for its doorway into potential new trauma, seeks the familiar above all else. And the familiar is two-faced. On the one hand, you have the familiar identity. This is me. I know who I am because I am the one that thinks this, feels this, does this, says this. I cling to it. Now, it may be the very identity that causes endless suffering. It may be the most horrendously boring, mediocre identity. But to the degree that I fear the unknown, I will cling to the me that I know, and I will fight the me that I do not know as an enemy. And to the degree that I fight what I do not know, I must also fight changes in the environment. Because if I'm in a new environment with new people, I will change. My identity will change. And if I'm afraid of the unknown, I cannot accept that. So I must cling to the people in my past as a way of avoiding and escaping the dread of the unknown, the terror of the unfamiliar, of change. Clinging to identity equals clinging to memories or realities that gave birth to that identity. This leads to a tragic, a puzzling, an important circle of energy to understand. Traumatic and unregulated energy is given by traumatized individuals to their infants. All patterns of energy, cultural, mental, emotional activity, are viral in nature. The only people capable of inducing helplessness and grief and pain and trauma in the world of an infant is an individual who is in that state to some extent. So, a traumatic culture gives traumatic energy, unregulated, dissociative energy, to an infant who cannot digest the energy, who experiences trauma, PTSD, shame, a sense of unworthiness, a sense of unlovability. Now, in the hierarchy of identity, the first movement is to move from out of control to in control. It's interesting with abused children when you watch them systematically doing the things that lead to the violence. I was with a severely abused young boy, I think it was probably around 7, 8 years old. And it was astounding to watch how he could draw out the abuser, which is potential in every human being. He could draw out the abusive identity reliably in almost everyone around him. I remember being frightened of him because he, in a matter of 20 minutes, could make me go from feeling peaceful and at one with the world to wanting to strangle him. And I wasn't at peace with the part of me that wanted to strangle little boys. So I was afraid. And yet, what was he doing? He was recreating, having experienced enough traumatic abuse to be terrified of the unknown, to be terrified of the world. He didn't want to see it change. And kind people were unfamiliar to him. Peaceful people didn't make sense in the paradigm of the scary world that he came to expect through so much exposure. And so he would elicit the world that he knew so that he could be the identity that was safe, the identity that didn't change. The PTSD patient who relives the event over and over again and doesn't change, the fear doesn't lift, The memory goes over and over again, and the identity at an overwhelming moment is frozen in time, unable to move, unable to evolve, fixated, to avoid the terror of the unknown, which is 99.9% of all reality, which is the vast portion of all reality. It is avoiding a collision with mass that is 99.9% bigger than ourselves, the unknown, the future, out there, all those energy objects out there, and it's reestablishing a repetitive loop with a pattern of energy that we cling to, like drowning sailors holding rusty nails attached to soggy driftwood. It's the only thing we know, and so even as it punctures the body, it keeps us afloat amidst seas of vast energy and a terror of change. The child's world view, a microcosm of the loudest personal experiences of their lives, becomes one of pain, shock, and the fear of pain and shock, projected into the tapestry, the neutral tapestry of the unknown. The individual fights the change that would lead to healing, because that is also the change that leads to a changed identity, which is also the change that makes us vulnerable to the unknown, to the larger energies of which we are a part, that we have no trust in. When the giants around us were the ones that threatened our physical, emotional, sexual identities more than anyone else, more than anything else. When what was out there as giants was too big to respond to and would not attune to the child, it becomes a nightmare. And reality, the future, the vast arenas of who we are, become the most threatening thing to the identity of the traumatized child. People want us to stay the same, so their expectations will jive more closely with what they experience, giving them the illusion of being in control. In acting, it's called pigeonholing. We see a Jim Carrey playing Dumb and Dumber, and we want that. We don't want to arrive and find that our expectation has nothing to do with a changing identity. As the identity that is Jim Carrey grows as an actor, grows as an individual, we don't like it, because it reveals how vulnerable we are to change. It reveals that despite our attachment to staying the same, which means an attachment to other people staying the same and the world staying the same, that we don't have the control to orchestrate the cessation of life, the cessation of movement. But we discourage change in others just as they discourage change in us, which is one reason for the birth of the city. To go into a vast place where no one knows you, where you can find your own energy pattern without the buffeting of a crowd around you that demands that you behave consistently to their expectations, consistently to the past. Cultural identity is default. Parental identity is default. To individuate we must move through the instinctive, survival-oriented yes of every child to the instinctive and reactive no of every adolescent. We must move through the unconditional acceptance of English, of our religion, of our way of doing things, and the reactive rejection, all cults being flawed, all identities, including pain. The adolescent rejects it all. I don't want any of that. Nothing to do with my parents. Those fucked up, fraudulent, hypocrite ministers. Those corrupt, idiotic government officials. I want nothing to do with any of it. The default yes of the child, the instinctive rebellion of the adolescent, leads to the possibility of a distinct adult to be born at a time when that identity becomes relatively self-sufficient, capable of surviving, feeling security, feeling love and belonging in a new, distinct, and carefully evaluated pattern of energy, in a new identity created in the synergy of the status quo, of the rejection of the status quo, and the new third energy that emerges in between. I love my boyfriend. Everything about him is amazing. I hate my boyfriend. Everything about him is terrible and rotten. I can see that this man has certain strengths that are incredible, certain shortcomings that are dangerous in this area and not in this. I appreciate the determination to keep fighting for something good, even with so little knowledge. I don't like this. I like this. I develop a new relationship with a complex human being who is neither demon or angel, but a unique human being through and with whom I have a unique relationship with myself and with them and with the world. I am an adult in that relationship. I go from the unconditional yes and surrender to my religion to the disdainful bitterness and betrayal of that naivete, often with, let's go to the East, let's have Buddhism, let's do this, something other than the opposite of whatever this is. And then in time and appreciation, different people do different things with this truth. Different people do different things with this truth. I like what this person does with this sentence in the Bible. I like this person's interpretation from the original Roman and Greek, etc., to what this means. I want to do this. And a new and adult relationship is formed that contains the wisdom in the rejection, the wisdom and the goodness in the unconditional yes, and something more. The wisdom and the flavor from the outside, from a larger world and environment. And something unique, something that I see uniquely because of my unique relationship with all that is 100% distinct. You don't have my memories at my emphasis, at my sensitivity threshold, in my sequence, with my paradigm. That's mine. I'm an adult. And I hold the energy pattern of an adult identity which with trauma can go into regression. If I'm practicing my version of Christianity in my town and my wife is raped, to punish me from deviation, from threatening a traumatized cult with change. My children are taken away and indoctrinated. And my business is broken into, and I cannot survive. I cannot feel secure. The identity that I have constructed for myself as an adult is imploding in the traumatic conflict with a force that is larger than me. The force of fear, the force of ignorance, the force of violence, the force of rage, and the mass of the majority, unprotected, unrestrained, untempered, threatens my identity, and I will lose that adult position and go back to a child. Or I will die in the transcendence of the spiritual adult, that metaphor of Christ, understanding something and feeling compassion for the trauma, the terror, and the pain of people so frightened of change and the unknown that any deviation from the norm is so terrifying they must kill it to avoid the transformation occurring inside, the transformation that will bring us face to face with the unknown. The transformation that may expose us to our greatest fears, our greatest pain, our greatest shame, our greatest shock in our body, in our hearts, in our mind, the rupture in which the identity met a force larger than itself and came close to shattering, or did shatter and had to be rebuilt in the terror of knowing it could happen again at any time, that the world is bigger than us and thus cannot be controlled by us. Our only choice is how small and repeatedly do we cling to what's familiar versus go out there and taste a little bit of the larger self, a little bit of the larger ecological matrix out of which we emerged, of which we are a part. That the illusion of distinct identity, the illusion of ego cannot take away from us, because every breath and every moment is inextricably connected with every other pattern of energy in the multiverse of which we are a part.